Saying anything definite about Pokemon is a horrible idea, and it's how we get into a lot of trouble. And by a lot of trouble, I mean getting into big fights in YouTube comment sections, or on Reddit, or on Discord, or wherever else you may go. Getting into huge fights is something I like a lot. Sometimes I have to break them up, and sometimes I start them. Today, I would like to start one by saying that the worst decision Pokemon has ever made as a game series is removing HMs. No, not the Universal Experience Share or Dexit, but HMs. Every Pokemon fan has that one mechanic or design choice from some generation that stirs their soul to irritation. For me, it's the removal of HMs. HMs were an item from way back in the olden days that taught moves necessary for traversing the world. Surf, Cut, Flash, and you know the rest. They have been contentious for as long as I've played Pokemon, and ever since their removal in Sun and Moon, HMs have been a sore spot in discussion about the older Pokemon games. This video is not going to be concerned with making the case for HMs. Many people hate them, and that's fine. This video, the third in an unintentional voyage through the Pokemon series, is instead a vehicle for me to pour all the praise I can out of my filthy heart onto the third generation of Pokemon, the Game Boy Advance games, Ruby, Sapphire, and Emerald. Because people will be curious, Fire Red and Leaf Green, also technically a part of Generation 3, will be looked at next time. Today is all about Ruby, Sapphire, and Emerald. The reason I start the video with HMs is because my love for this controversial mechanic is core to my love of Generation 3 and to Pokemon more broadly. Pokemon is, for me, a game series that's at its best when adventuring and collecting share an equal slice of the game loop with battling and building a powerful team. HMs, in their own strange way, are central to tracking the player's growth as a trainer since gym badges are needed to use them and also test the player's ability to build a party and have the flexibility required to use all the HMs, as well as being the tools needed to fully explore the world. As the pool of available HMs expands, so too does the world, making the waters and forests and caves accessible for adventuring and collecting and battling. With Gen 3, the problem isn't just that there are HMs and that there are 8 of them, but that 3, Surf, Dive, and Waterfall, are all water types. Seemingly, the option here is to either have 2 water types on your team, or have 1 water type with all 3 moves. As is always the case with these games, you don't have to do what you think you have to do. In a playthrough that I streamed on YouTube, where I only used mouth-type Pokemon, I had 2 water types, with Pelipper and Sharpedo. But in reality, the only water HM you need and want on one of your permanent party members is Surf, which isn't so bad, because Surf is both really powerful and can also be learned by all Gen 3 water types and the immaculate Zigzagoon. Surf and its obscene 95 base power does reveal another major problem that people have with HMs that both does and does not bother me. Even though there is a huge variety of water types in Gen 3, 15 different evolution lines in total, including a split evolution line of Clamperl into Huntail or Gorbis, and the part-time water-type cast form, and other cool types like the Water Bug Surskit and the Rock-Water Relicanth. However, for all of the water types, Surf will be the main same-type attack bonus or stab move. It's a 100% accurate move, and with Stab, its base power is an effective 142.5, which makes it the strongest water move in the game that has no downside. Hydro Pump can miss. So can Hydro Cannon if you're a sick freak transferring a Totodile over from Coliseum. And also Hydro Cannon has to spend a turn recharging. Woo! Bad DPS! It is kind of boring to see the diverse ecosystem of water types all condensed down to surfing, but it's the opposite problem of some of the other HMs in Gen 3. The fighting type HM, Rock Smash, is incredibly weak. Rock Smash has a base power of 20, which happens to also be the effective base power of a Bullet Seed that only hits twice, except Bullet Seed can hit 5 times. A Stab super effective Rock Smash has a base power of 60, which is less base power than non-Stab, non-super effective Surf. A Stab super effective Surf has a base power of 285, and if we're playing a double battle, a new Gen 3 mechanic we'll dig into later, it also hits both of an opponent's Pokemon. Sure, in Generation 3, power is cut in half for moves that target both opponent Pokemon, but a Stab super effective Surf cut in half is a base power of 142.5, which is 2.375 times as strong as the Stab super effective Rock Smash. Sure, it sucks, because it does, but in a way, these weak HMs end up being more interesting because they solve the problem of traversing the overworld and create the new problem of being terrible in battle. Since HMs cannot be easily removed, they effectively reduce a Pokemon's move slots from 4 to 3. Let's take Exploud, for example. In my run at Emerald, my Exploud, Crybaby, was my Rock Smasher, meaning she had one dead space in her move pool. She was also my Strength user, but with Strength being 80 base power with Stab, making it an effective 120 base power, I had Stab covered and it was pretty good. Unfortunately, it was not as novel or interesting as a move like Stab Return because I needed Strength and Exploud was able to take advantage of Stab Strength. For coverage, I taught her Overheat, a great move because it covered my blind spot to Steel types, and despite the downside of it sharply lowering mental attack, it didn't matter because both Strength and the destructive Hyper Beam deal physical damage. And oh yeah, I had Hyper Beam because sometimes you need to have fun with an effective 225 base power attack. Let's watch something get blown up by Hyper Beam. For the other two water HMs, story progress is only locked behind 2 uses of Dive and 1 use of Waterfall. There are many other locations in the game that can be dived and waterfalled, but for story progress you can just as easily catch a Love Disc on Route 128, teach it Dive and Waterfall, and have it contribute 3 more times than any other Love Disc has ever contributed to a run of Pokemon Emerald. It's actually the progression to Hoenn through its many HMs that I consider the true accomplishment of the game. The perfectly fine overworld maps of Red, Blue, Yellow, Gold, Silver, and Crystal are good. They provide choice and adventure, and it's great, but once you're finished in an area, you rarely need to come back, with the exception of a couple of Nexus points. The map design of Gen 3 is much more intricately layered, both mechanically and narratively. It's weird to say this because the canonical complaint, both legitimate and facetious, about Gen 3 is that it has too much water on its map. While I can't be 100% sure yet, something about there being too much water will likely be the golden ratio thumbnail with action words and an iconic Gen 3 Pokemon wrapping around them. Look, if you don't like it, keep in mind that YouTube works in such a way that the video is meant to be good and the end result of self-expressive criticism, while the thumbnail is for the algorithm. And also while you're at it, if you like the video, hit subscribe. And also consider joining Patreon down in the link below for as little as $1 a month to keep these videos going. Regardless, the claim that Gen 3 has too much water is a difficult one to parse. The phrase itself makes fun of an IGN bullet point at the end of their Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire review, but it's also a genuine complaint held against these games. The problem, though, is that this overemphasis on one terrain type obfuscates the depth of Hoenn's map. If I may indulge in a quick summary of the first 5 badges of Emerald, I think it'll help show the delicacy of Hoenn's map design. I hate summary in most videos, so I promise to keep this under a minute. If you don't mind getting a timer set up, Nin, let's begin. We start in Little Root Town, a place whose name reminds us where we are planted and of our nascent strength. We travel north to Old L Town, back to Little Root, then up and over to Petalburg City, a city whose name tells us that we are beginning to sprout from our roots, both now and in our return journey. We travel northwest through Petalburg Woods into Rustboro City and then into Rust Turf Tunnel. After collecting our first badge and saving Mr. Briney's Wingull, the player travels south on Mr. Briney's Trawler to Dewford Town and then east to Slateport City. From Slateport, you head north to Mauville City. After attaining the Dynamo badge from Watson, you head east to Verdant Turf Town and pick up the Strength HM from Rust Turf Tunnel, and with Rock Smash, we can now use Rust Turf Tunnel to quickly return to Rustboro. We then head north from Mauville through routes 111 and 112. The cable car is blocked for now, so we go through the Fiery Path, past boulders we can't yet move. From the Fiery Path, we go through Route 113 and reach Fall Arbor Town. We then head south to Meteor Falls. Meteor Falls leads south back to Rustboro, which lets us quickly run back through Verdant Turf and Mauville to reach the cable car, which now takes us to Mountain Chimney, which connects us to Lava Ridge Town, where we can get the Heat badge from Flannery, allowing us to use Strength. We must now head back to Petalburg City. Unlike the rest of the map up to this point, we are now presented with multiple choices. We can go back to Meteor Falls and south to Rustboro, we can run back to Mr. Briney and Slateport, or we can take Rust Turf Tunnel to Rustboro. Once we reach Petalburg, we challenge Norman, our father, for the Balance Badge and the right to use Surf outside of battle and access to the mid-game. We have grown from a root to a petal, we have sprouted, and now the game begins to open up. Hoenn's map folds back over itself, always leading the player to where they need to go, and does so through clever Lordranian interconnectivity that makes the player more intimately familiar with Hoenn than any other region in the series. It also tests the player on everything they will need to beat the game. Can the player construct a team to accommodate all the HMs needed to explore Hoenn? Can the player construct a team that can take on the rock, fighting, electric, fire, and normal type gyms? A sequence that shares no common weakness, with ground being the only type super effective against at least 3 of these gyms. The early game of Pokémon Generation 3 is deliberately and thoughtfully constructed, challenging the player in ways that reward engaging with the diversity of Pokémon presented in Hoenn and their newly diversified natural movesets. This is the hardest opening stretch of any Pokémon game up to this point, particularly in Emerald, but it's nothing insurmountable for Pokémon's young audience. Through the limitations of HMs and the limitations in team composition early game, Pokémon Gen 3 continues the early trend in the series of primarily rewarding flexibility and growth above building a fully operational battleship as quickly as possible. This was a topic in my video covering Gold, Silver, and Crystal that garnered some comment section controversy, which is that Pokémon, by its design in both single-player and competitive, rewards flexibility and often encourages it. The 3 water HMs are a problem if you stubbornly stick to a singular, immovable party of 6. Just put one Pokemon in the box for like 15 minutes for Dive, and then for another 5 to use Waterfall to reach Evergrande City. There's even a Pokemon Sitter right before Victory Road, so you don't even need to sacrifice a team member for Victory Road. In this way, early Pokemon offers us a fascinating look at the most contentious part of game design analysis, the dichotomy between what players want and what a game asks. I hate to be ornery this early in the morning, but one of the great challenges in discussing game design is that a framework used by many people is a framework of convenience. I've read many posts and reviews and seen videos and received many comments in the past, and certainly more in the future, and perhaps even some on this very video, that criticize games for presenting challenges that don't conform with what they believe the game should be. A common example of this is when Pokemon become available. In my Gen 2 video, there was some pushback that can be summarized as, it doesn't matter if the game intentionally makes Houndour and Larvitar unavailable until the second half of the game. I want Houndoom and Tyranitar early, and it's bad game design that I can't have that. Perhaps that's an uncharitable way to summarize the argument, but I also think that this line of reasoning misinterprets video games, the medium at large, and the video game Pokemon in specificity. It's an argument that, like the Dungeons & Dragons player who gets angry at a DM who doesn't just let them bypass charisma rolls with whatever bullshit they say to NPCs, posits that the games are there to serve the needs and petty desires of players. This could broadly be understood as true, since most games want to be fun to some extent, but games also have to be designed with rules and restrictions in mind. Even in a sandbox, the makeshift castles follow the laws of physics. Many Pokemon games are designed with RPG progression in mind, not just because Pokemon grow in levels to get stronger, but also because there is a machine of numbers underneath every turn in every battle. Some Pokemon, like Houndoom and Tyranitar, are so powerful that their emergence must be held off until the numbers machine can withstand them. Sometimes this also works in conjunction with Pokemon's Collectathon side quest, the Pokédex. Beldum, the arm finger Pokemon, evolves into the incredibly powerful Metagross, a disgusting combination of Psychic and Steel, but is locked behind beating the Elite Four. It's a reward worthy of conquering a difficult challenge, helps the player complete their Pokédex, and in competitive, it's a declaration that you're him. For single-player fans, it keeps opponents dynamic until the end of the game. The first time a player is likely to see Pokemon like Milotic, Metagross, or Salamence is the Elite Four, and that's an effective way to make even these late-game trainers intimidating to a fully trained player team. But even for Pokemon that aren't particularly good, like the Forlorn Luvdisc or Emerald Mawile, a sprinkling of new Pokemon throughout the game keeps the new areas interesting while also constantly introducing new discoveries to fill out the Pokédex with. Sure, Kecleon is awesome, and I would love to have one as soon as possible, but by delaying the Rotten Bastard's first appearance to Fortree City, it gets to have a memorable set piece where the Devon Scope must be used to turn all the invisible Kecleons visible, not unlike the also morbidly memorable Ghost Marowak in Red and Blue. Pokemon Emerald, like Generations 1 and 2 before it, is a game about flexibility and discovery, and the mastery required to fully explore Hoenn and to complete the Pokédex and to beat the Elite Four is found within this framework. Pokemon is a series of deep customization, but the customization is done within the frameworks of the games, within their RPG progression systems, and within the needs of exploration, and not based on the instant gratification of every whim of the player. This is actually a case where future Pokemon games do unintentionally create a misreading of the older games. Small, specific changes, like the early Latios or Latias being gifted to the player in Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire, can have radical changes to how a player approaches the game and views the game. Larger changes, like the free roam open world in Scarlet and Violet, show a change in design priority in the series to create more opportunities to get powerful Pokemon, and more Pokemon in general, early. It's easy to retroactively apply the direction a series takes later on to its earlier entries, which I think does a great disservice to understanding and enjoying the games. I'm a big believer that criticism must first begin from an understanding of what a game is, rather than what I think it should be to best accommodate my tastes or playstyle or what I want. Despite being a game for children, or perhaps because of that, Pokemon Emerald has a peculiar way it wants you to engage with it. It wants you to build your team over the course of the entire game. It wants you to work around the restrictions of HMs, and to be reactive to the problems that the game puts in front of you. There is very little in Pokemon Emerald that could be done out of order. You could fight Brawly, the 2nd gym leader, as your 3rd or 4th if you want, and Winona, the 6th gym leader, as your 7th or 8th, although I wouldn't recommend it with Winona because the Feather Badge gives you access to fly. It is, however, very funny to fight Brawly right before Norman and destroy him. But ultimately, Pokemon Emerald progresses in a singular path without much variance. A great benefit to this wrapping linearity is that it gives the game plenty of opportunities to teach the player about many of the new mechanical changes introduced in Gen 3. The 4 major mechanical changes in Generation 3 are the introductions of abilities, double battles, natures, and effort values. All 4 of these additions have had radical impact on competitive Pokemon gameplay to this day, as well as presenting major changes to casual single-player Pokemon. I listed these changes in descending order for how much they affect single-player. Effort values, or EVs, have basically no impact on casual single-player and are rarely mentioned by the game itself, while abilities offer a radical restructuring of how Pokemon can be utilized in battle both by the player and the AI. Competitive Pokemon isn't something I know much about or have invested time into. It's simply outside the scope of my knowledge and of this video, but I would feel bad not mentioning what Gen 3 adds to competitive play. EVs are a type of sub-experience given to Pokemon based on what Pokemon they fight, and it dictates how much a Pokemon grows or doesn't grow in a stat. For competitive, being conscientious of EVs is paramount to building your Pokemon for competition. In casual play, it's never much of a concern. I've gone my entire life without ever paying attention to EVs. It's simply not relevant to casual play, but EVs do represent a consistent strength of Pokemon's growth as a franchise. Competitive Pokemon tournaments go back at least as far as the Nintendo Cup in 1997, and from that point on, competitive play has had an impact on what new Pokemon mechanics are introduced and how they're utilized. EVs are clearly implemented to make the competitive game deeper, to make training a Pokemon up more intentional than simply grinding out levels. Since there are limits to how many EVs a Pokemon can gain over the course of its lifetime, you have to make a call on which stats you want your Pokemon to excel at, and which ones you don't mind it lagging behind in. If I wanted to make my Sharpedo as good as it could possibly be, I would focus on getting speed and special attack EVs to maximize how fast and how hard it can hit with its special water and dark attacks. Natures do the same for Pokemon, except they are important during the catching stage rather than the training stage. Natures do 2 things. They lower one stat of a Pokemon's by 10%, and raise another stat by 10%. So when catching my Sharpedo as a lowly Carvanha, I wanted it to have a modest nature so that its unused attack stat gets lowered by 10%, while its highly relevant special attack stat is raised by 10% to let it hit even harder. Now I'm not sure if this is what you would want to do to make a good competitive Sharpedo. Here's Zero Kim Chess's write-up on a tier-appropriate Sharpedo build. In my playthrough, I didn't care about any of this. I simply didn't need to. My goal was to defeat the Elite Four and catch all 7 of the legendary Pokemon, and to defeat Steven, the hidden super boss at the end of the game. All of these goals are completely within reach without engaging with natures or EVs. To do all that, you simply need to focus on good, old-fashioned team and moveset building. And I think it speaks very well of Pokemon's ability to add depth to the competitive game without adding unneeded burden to the single-player campaign. The other two major changes in raising and battling Pokemon, double battles and abilities, have an incredible impact on single player. Double battles have both the player and the opponent use two Pokemon at the same time. This creates an interesting series of considerations commonplace in other RPGs but not in Pokemon, such as kill order. When you're facing Tate and Liza, the Psychic Gym, they open with a Xatu and a Claydol. You have to decide which one you're going to kill first, or if you're going to split your damage in an attempt to kill them both at the same time to effectively steal a turn from Tate and Liza if you can somehow pull it off. I would personally recommend you take down Claydol first, because what I learned the hard way in my playthrough is that Claydol has Earthquake, a 100 base power move made an effective 150 base power by Claydol's ground typing. Earthquake is a move like Surf. It hits both of the opponent's Pokemon during a double battle. The only problem is that unlike Surf, which gets its power cut in half, Earthquake hits with its full, beautiful, incandescent 150 base power because it also targets the user's allied Pokemon. Seems great to have the boss kill itself like that, except Xatu is part flying type, making it immune to Earthquake. Right from the first turn, Tate and Liza demonstrate the synergistic options available to the player with double battles. It doesn't just matter what Pokemon you use, but how they and their moves work together. Earthquake on one Pokemon with a flying type in the other slot is a classic, usable by just about anyone, but Tate and Liza don't stop there. If you kill the Xatu, they will be forced to switch into a Lunatone or a Solrock, both rock types who will be instantly destroyed by Earthquake. Turn the tables against them. Be clever. Be smart, like me. Oh. So both Lunatone and Solrock have Levitate, an ability that makes them immune to ground-type moves. Abilities are, simply, an immutable attribute of a Pokemon that is always engaged. Some examples include Silcoon and Cascoon Shedskin, which can cure status ailments, and Manectric Static, which has a chance to paralyze a Pokemon that hits it with a contact move. Early on, abilities were often limited to a small handful of Pokemon, which helped to further differentiate Pokemon. It adds to the uniqueness of each Pokemon, but it doesn't mean that all abilities are good. Some, like Levitate, are incredibly powerful. For Tate and Liza, it means they get to avoid a major weakness of Claydol, Lunatone, and Solrock. For Norman, his Slacking's Truant ability is one that works almost entirely within the player's favor. Truant makes his Slacking unable to move every other turn. Moves like Protect and Detect, which shield a Pokemon for one turn, can be used to make Slacking entirely ineffectual. It's an ability designed primarily to hurt Norman by giving him a glaring weakness to his otherwise statistically overwhelming ace. Abilities do change the Pokemon formula significantly, introducing an increased importance to minutia like contact moves, a subcategory that further divides moves along the lines of physical, mental, status, and attack. Even though abilities are introduced in Generation 3, in a way, I feel that an exhaustive analysis of them is best saved for Generation 4, where they would compound with the physical special split and affect every aspect of Pokemon battling, team construction, and moveset construction. To return to Tate and Liza, they are, for my money, the best gym fight across the first three generations, at least in Emerald where they were given the Xatu and Claydol. Not only do they take advantage of double battle subtleties with type synergy, they also take advantage of abilities. Two new mechanics to Gen 3 shown off in one excellent battle. When I was a kid, I really struggled with this fight because not only is Tate and Liza's team well constructed with Xatu's flying type and Lunatone and Solrock's rock types canceling out Psychic's bug weakness, and all four Pokemon being immune to Earthquake, but also because of the nature of double battles. For the first 8 generations, Pokemon had a sort of hidden difficulty option in its menu, Shift and Set mode. For many kids who never check the options, and many older people like myself who don't care, Shift mode is the default Pokemon experience. In Shift mode, after you knock out an enemy Pokemon, you are told what the opponent's next Pokemon is going to be, and are given the option to freely switch out your current Pokemon. It's basically a way to cheat the system. Sort of. The greatest consequence of Shift mode is that if you're playing a game for the first time and don't know what the Pokemon are, it can act as a way to build anticipation. If Steven's Metagross is the first Metagross you've seen in the entire game, what are you going to do? What can you do? You've seemingly beaten the game and are now being jumped by a brand new Pokemon. It can add to the anticipation and anxiety of a first playthrough while still operating entirely within the player's favor. You are given a huge advantage not afforded the AI in a way that basically lets you always set the pace and tempo of a fight. For young players especially, this really takes the edge off, but double battles are always in set mode. In set mode, you have to use your Pokemon's turn to switch out, which means your incoming Pokemon is at risk of taking an earthquake to the face. Because Generation 3 is exceptionally mean, you don't even get a free switch in if you die in the middle of a turn during double battles. It means that Tate and Liza are going to pressure most players more than they're used to, because the Uno skip card granted to players in most boss battles is absent. Tate and Liza aren't too difficult. Once you know the score, it's easy to rush them down and win, especially because their secondary gimmick, a Soul Rock with Sunny Day, Flamethrower, and Solar Beam, isn't as synergistic with the rest of the party as Claydol is. It is a nasty move pool to be sure, but because Solrock must set up its own Sunny Day for a huge buff to Flamethrower and to skip the charge turn of Solar Beam, it means there's a free turn to Rain Dance or Waterfall or Hydro Pump it out of existence. That is, of course, if it doesn't bypass all that and blast you with Psychic, which it might because all 4 of their Pokemon have Psychic. Why not? Double battles are probably the most exciting addition to Pokemon across all 9 of its generations. Not only are the battles strategically deeper, with the Generation 3 spin-offs Colosseum and XD Gale of Darkness being built entirely around double battles, they allow more of the gimmicky nonsense Pokemon and moves that have been added in Generation 2 to not be so gimmicky and not so nonsensical. In our video about Generation 2, I focused on a lot of the new gimmicks for catching Pokemon, like the Day-Night Cycle and Headbutting Trees, but I didn't focus on any of the added gimmicks for Pokemon battles and Pokemon movesets. Gold, Silver, and Crystal added quite a few weird, cool, awesome options to Pokemon's battle system. Entry hazards created by moves like Spikes were added, weather effects like Rain and Sandstorm were added, and there were Pokemon with bizarre movesets like the entirely customizable Smeargle, and min-maxed base stats like Shuckle. In single player, many of these gimmicks ran into the problem that many RPG gimmick builds and mechanics run into, which is that they simply weren't worth setting up. Like poison weapons in Dark Souls or using status effects in old school Final Fantasy, it was simply quicker and easier to use Pokemon and moves that killed faster. Enemy Pokemon are just weak in Gen 2, even when they have the Paper Tiger levels of Red's Pokemon. In general, Generation 3 still has the same problem that plagues every RPG that isn't Final Fantasy XIII, but with double battles being as flush as they are in Emerald, mechanics like Weather and newly added gimmick Pokemon like Plusle, Minun, and Castform are much more useful than they would be in the olden days of singles only. Before anyone tries to jump me and says that I'm saying Weather was bad in Gen 2, I'm not saying that. I'm saying that it wasn't really worth it in single player because the Pokemon you fought were usually so weak that the turn spent setting up Rain Dance would be better spent one-shotting the opponent with a super effective move. In single player double battles, the opportunity cost isn't as high because you can set up Rain Dance and use Thunder on the same turn, or do the same with Sunny Day and Flamethrower or Solar Beam. Castform is a Pokemon whose gimmick is that it can use Rain Dance, Hail, and Sunny Day while transforming into the weather's corresponding type. Building around that is surprisingly easy because Castform's signature attacking move, Weather Ball, is deceptively great. It's a 50 base power normal move, but it changes type depending on the weather and doubles in power. With no weather effect, Weather Ball is a decent move with stab. You know, decent like cut or tackle. It doesn't do negative damage. But since Castform changes type along with the weather, Weather Ball becomes an effective 150 base power move in weather, since the move itself doubles in base power, and Castform gets to take advantage of stab, and, well, that's not all, because in rainy conditions, water moves get a 50% buff to power. So if Castform sets up Rain Dance, Weather Ball becomes a 225 base power move, with its power doubling from the weather effect, gaining an extra 50% from being a water-type move in the rain, and gaining another 50% from stab. In a double battle, this also means you could be running Castform alongside a Stab Surf Pokemon, with Stab and Rain making Surf an effective 213.75 base power. That's pretty good. Even Pokemon that seem bad from base stats, like Plusle and Minun, get to be very silly with double battles. Their abilities, Plus and Minus, boost their special attack by 50% when they're on the field together. It's unfortunately a gimmick that's a little too precise and it's set up to be great all the time, but for most double battles, it doesn't matter if Electric is being doubled up by these little Pikachu clones because they can just hit so hard with plus, minus, and stab all running. And if you want to be even more heinous, you can always try Helping Hand, a priority move that buffs an ally's dealt damage on that turn by 50%. Sometimes, you just gotta do it to them. All these changes introduced in Generation 3 are shown off before the player ever has to set sail. There's a feeling that when you get Surf and you get access to the wide oceans of Hoenn, that you've matured, that you've grown, and you're truly ready to conquer the adventure laid out before you in Ruby, Sapphire, and Emerald. On an emotional level, the early game ending with the ability to cross water, and that ability being what opens up the map, is deeply resonant. To be fair to its critics, it's worth at least acknowledging the complaints against all the water in the game. Water in Pokemon has always been annoying, primarily because every single water tile can spawn a random encounter, just like caves, and decisively unlike overland routes where only tall grass can hold random encounters. Sure, this can be circumvented with repels, but repels can't be registered hotbar items in Gen 3, so every time a repel wears out, you have to go into the menu and reapply it. An aggravating problem if you're a moron like me who foolishly bought regular repels instead of max repels. There are 34 routes in Gen 3, and of those 34, 16 are water routes. With 47% of the game's routes being primarily water, some with dive locations that make them even longer, problems can compound. Mostly because water routes are often wider than the Game Boy Advance screen that houses them, making it often required to glide aimlessly from left to right or up and down to make sure you've seen all the different rock formations that girdle the routes on the off chance you've missed an item or a trainer encounter. It's also the water that causes the HM anxiety that overwhelms the senses of many players with Surf, Waterfall, and Dive. However, it is this copious amount of water and how it's arranged that make Generation 3 the most evocative, the most beautiful, and the most dreamlike of all Pokemon games. The first 5 badges of the game keep the player entirely earthbound. With the exception of Mr. Briny's boat, every encounter with the sea is a dead end. The layout of Hoenn, as we saw at the beginning, pulls the player along a single, folding, winding path. The sea is a permanent obstacle on our journey from Little Root to Petalburg. When we finally beat Norman in some sort of Freudian freak show to demonstrate our maturity through the conquest of our father, Surf is what opens up the paths. It's then the seas that grant us freedom and responsibility. Not only does the eastern half of the map open up to us, along with the routes between Petalburg and Slateport, but the responsibilities of the player character expand. Our germination now complete, the roughshod pace that takes us through the first 5 badges plummets as the world-altering plans of Teams Magma and Aqua begin to overwhelm the story and our path forward. And yet, with all the insane plans of the evil gangs, there's a great piece to the look and the music of Generation 3 Water. Sitting out on the waves of Hoenn stirs a similar feeling to the oceanscapes of Claude Monet. It sounds absurd, but the first time I saw his paintings in person, I was struck by the same feeling I get from playing Pokémon Emerald. His painting, Misty Morning at Pourville, sits with the same optimistic tranquility as the seas east of Lily Cove when you first set sail into the eastern waters. The light yellows and greens and blues and oranges that color Monet's seas are seemingly unnatural to the color of ocean water, but feel right, capturing the sound of the gentle rolling waves that break beneath your surfing Pokemon. The impressionistic strokes of Monet's brush aren't much different from the suggestive designs of Game Boy Advance Pokemon, using a few non-specific pixels to create an image evocative of the coastlines of Lily Cove and tree houses of Fortree and caves of Dewford and the waterfalls guarding Evergrande, the final step you must climb to become the champion. Beyond its aesthetic evocations, the sea itself has been the symbol of coming of age in narrative fiction for hundreds of years. History is built on the water, and water is the natural barrier, the Earth's most common obstacle to movement. But, by the same, the conquest of the water is what frees human growth and travel. If the gods of the machine on YouTube allow me, the famous ending of Francois Truffaut's The 400 Blows shows us Antoine Donnel, our vagabond hero, escaping from juvenile detention and running to the sea. His dream has been to visit the ocean, and in the moment he finally reaches the rolling waters on the shore, he turns back inland, unsure of what's next now that he's reached the borderline of his dreams. Pokémon, likewise, tells similar stories of growing up, of the urge to leave home and find the place in the world that you belong to. In contrast to the 400 Blows or other coming-of-age stories like Mother and Earthbound, Pokémon takes place in a fundamentally good world occupied by good people. People give you items to help you on your adventure, you can heal your Pokémon for free, and when struggles against the villainous gangs gets too intense, there's always someone there to help. The animals themselves, the Pokémon that populate the world, are your friends and your allies. There's a Mr. Rogers neighborhood homeliness to the world where everyone is kind and just, and when there is struggle, it exists to help us to learn and to grow. The world of Pokémon is the childhood of our minds. A nostalgic world made up of a collage of happy memories that can easily cut around the heartache of youth. Ruby, Sapphire, and Emerald capture this better than any other Pokémon game, partially because this is the Pokémon game I have the most nostalgia for. And Pokémon has a mysterious way of stirring the oldest memories of your life if you let it. But also because they're the most aesthetically rich games in the series. It extends in every direction, from the literary symbolism of the names Littleroot and Petalburg, to the rural peace of Littleroot Town's music, the cascading shades of green on the trees that line the cities and forests, the reflections of clouds off of puddles, and the trail of footsteps in the sand that fade almost as soon as they come to be. No other game in the series, not Fire Red or Leaf Green, not the DS games, capture the same easy winds of July. Whenever I sit down and play Gen 3, even for a moment, they feel like those summer days from some lost time, and perhaps also like the summer days yet to be. A portion of that is nostalgia. Pokémon Sapphire was the first game that was ever my own. I remember the day I got it from Toys R Us, along with a purple Game Boy Advance and Winnie the Pooh Adventures in the 100-Acre Woods for Game Boy Color. I remember that night, desperately trying to see the screen. This was before the backlit Game Boy Advance SP, and you had to suffer every glare known to man. Of what I could make out, the symbols of the battle commands mystified me further. Somehow, and I'm not sure how or when, I made progress. I never beat it, but I still have it. This old Sapphire cartridge with this team of a Blaziken, Aggron, Castform, and Hariyama. Somehow, this flash save is still here. I won't belabor this point. Several years ago I made a video about this save file and this cartridge. It's linked down below in the pinned comment for the curious. It's odd to stare at this 20-year-old save file because it's the only thing from my life 20 years ago that remains definably the same. It's the only thing unchanged. This save file has, in stasis, outlived everything else. The people who are still here with me are older, either entering the prime of their lives or leaving them. 20 years captures the entire lifetime of the forever young man that introduced Pokémon Red to me so many years ago on his brick Game Boy. Pokémon, a game of total serenity, of eternal growth and limited loss, can, given enough time, come to represent the limitlessness of the future and the constraints of the past. Nostalgia is an emotion of happiness and an emotion of pain. A lyric by country artist Justin Townes Earle, he too taken too early from the world, also sticks with me when I play Gen 3 after all these years. Now it's gone, blown on a lonely wind of change. Now I feel like I miss it most, just because I never thought that it could change. Pokémon Gen 3 represents a difficult challenge for me. On one hand, art grows and changes with you. Reread that classic book you hated in high school 15 years ago. Maybe you'll find that it's just a bit different now. Pokémon Emerald, likewise, has changed. I found myself playing it, taken by its waters and renewed by my rediscovered vigor for Pokémon to have an experience that was entirely impossible in 2005. Yet, Gen 3 is permanently trapped in that Sapphire save file that I will never change, never overwrite, never delete, never progress on. It sits there as the last remaining piece of myself from 2003. It's unchanging, like the mountains, like the oceans. You can watch a tree grow, you can watch a town live and die. You can do that all in a lifetime without ever cheating the earth. The mountains and the oceans are eternal. They were here long before us, and they will be here long after us. What Teams Magma and Aqua fail to understand is that there's no cheating the world we have. Their quest is to overwhelm the world with land or water, respectively, leading to a clash between Groudon and Kyogre, the ground and water god Pokemon. Their mistake is that the world is as it is, and it's up to us not to destroy or change it, but to grow as part of it. If that means to become part of the immense bodies of water that dominate the east of Hoenn, then so be it. Joseph Conrad, the greatest modern writer of the water, is a deeply complicated writer to approach. His racism infects many of his stories, but if we, like hungry, greedy scavengers, take what we want from him, we see the universal nature of the water. In his short story, Youth the Narrative, the narrator, Marlowe, looking back upon his first journey at sea to the Far East, shows us what preoccupies Ruby, Sapphire, and Emerald. The ship he rides, the Judea, suffers comical mishap after comical mishap. Typhoons rage, cabins are blown off deck, the ship is sent in for repairs multiple times at the same wharf, and the coal room explodes, burning off Marlowe's hair and eyebrows. And yet, at the end, the Judea and all its cargo sunk, he rises to the command of a small rowboat and leads it to safety, beating out all the other boats that fled the Judea. Much as we do in Pokemon Emerald, the world is shattering underneath the emergence of Crowquaza. That's my portmanteau of Groudon, Kyogre, and Rayquaza. But we, the young man or woman coming of age in these times, take control and quell the earth and the seas, and like in Conrad's story, no one dies, no one is hurt. But we will all keep this adventure in our hearts, and know in our moment of triumph before the winds of time weather our bodies and our minds. In this way, Pokemon is uncommonly optimistic. Youth in Pokemon is the pure desire for adventure, and when that adventure is over, the game stops. There's no retrospection, and there's no questions or doubts. The games, especially Gen 3, are one long, beautiful summer. In Conrad's short novel, The Shadow Line, the narrator describes leaving his good-paying job on a ship for no real reason. He can't explain it as anything other than the emptiness in the soul unique to youth, where we constantly search outwardly and inwardly for something else, something different, even if we don't know what it is, or even if we know it's impossible to find. Pokemon answers this question by not asking it. What are we searching for in Pokemon? Nothing except adventure itself, and to find all the Pokemon out there and maybe collect a few badges and become the champion along the way, but perhaps most importantly, we are there to grow, and to see everyone around us, from our rivals Brendan and Wally and the antagonists themselves, grow. Pokemon never asks us to find what's missing, but instead to find what there is. In a way, that's its great beauty. Do any Pokemon games have good narratives? Probably not. I need to replay X and Y and Sun and Moon before making such a claim, but none are particularly deep. Some, like Sun and Moon, are more deliberately existential. Some, like Ruby, Sapphire, and Emerald, are more impressionistic. Yet, no matter what, Pokemon fans and the culture at large have never been able to let go of this series. Other fads come and go with lightning speed, but not this one. Perhaps it's because not only does Pokemon hold on to our pasts, it even holds up our future in an optimistic light, telling us that no matter where we go, on land or at sea, we are bound to find something good and worthwhile, something wonderful for us to behold. Woo! That was a mouthful, and with that, let's bring it on home. On the screen right now, on the left, you see the names of all the Patreon supporters over on patreon.com and YouTube members here on youtube.com. Thanks to their generous contributions, videos like this and many more are able to be produced. If you would like to help create videos like this, then consider supporting for as little as $1 a month or $10 a year over on patreon.com. See you all next time for, potentially, Fire Red and Leaf Green.